Hello, everybody. Good to see you, and I'm glad to be with you. Here in a few minutes, I'll be very glad to take your questions and to answer really anything that you may be curious about the issues of police brutality, social justice, even if there are some things that you're not clear on about the Black Lives Matter movement, or even if you have a critique that you'd like to offer and bounce off of me. I think this is a pretty safe space, and I'm glad to be able to connect with you. I actually live very close by, and like a lot of you, I've seen this building before, but had no idea what was inside of it. And it's just one of those spaces that you kind of drive and see through. And I don't know if any of you have ever been here before, but I'm glad to be here. And when you love Atlanta, it's always great to enter new spaces. And so I'm writing a new book. I have a book out that's totally unrelated to the social justice work that I do, that's more about setting and pursuing goals. But I'm writing a new book that challenges some of the notions that we have about ways America has improved. And I'm in grad school, and I'm pursuing a PhD in history. And I took this class called, I think it was like an introduction to historiography. And historiography is basically the study of history. And this man, this German scholar from the 1800s, Leopold von Ranke, has this idea, and it was really, this idea was really a footnote in the class. But it was one of those ideas that was a light bulb moment for me, and I just have not been able to shake it. And the idea that he gave is really the thesis of my book. And so as I speak around the country, what I'm really doing is testing out that thesis, and before I actually write the book, to make sure I actually believe it myself. But as I test it and as I share it with you, I hope it challenges some of your key ideas about American progress, and I hope it's insightful. Also, I hope to share a few very particular stories about police brutality. And so Shireen said, what I do professionally, really from 9 to 5, is currently I'm a writer for Daily Kos, which is an extremely liberal news platform. And I'm actually, being a Georgia Democrat would make you a Republican in most states. And so I'm very much, in a lot of ways, I'm very much a Georgia Democrat. I have very balanced perspectives on a lot of issues. And so when Daily Kos hired me a year ago, it was literally just days after Mike Brown had been killed in Ferguson. And Daily Kos saw the way I was telling and sharing stories from people on the ground in Ferguson. And only about a little less than a month before Mike Brown had been killed in Ferguson, Eric Garner, a father and actually a grandfather, was killed in Staten Island in New York by an NYPD officer. And that was on July 17th of last year, about a little less than a month before Mike Brown was killed. And it was actually the death of Eric Garner that impacted me very deeply. And like a lot of us, I had heard before the death of Eric Garner, I had heard stories of police brutality before. Bruce Springsteen had a song called 41 Shots about Amadou Diallo, who was really a great young man, an ambitious dreamer of a guy who was working hard in New York City, and on his way home, 4 police officers claimed that they thought he was someone else, and that when he pulled his wallet out, they believed it was a gun, and they shot at him 41 times. But it wasn't filmed. And we could, and so when Bruce Springsteen did this song, and when news outlets covered it, you could imagine what that was like, but you didn't see it. And when I saw what happened to Eric Garner, it was deeply disturbing for me. I seen war footage. I've seen some ugly stuff, but to see a man, and 11 different times he told the officers that he couldn't breathe, and he wasn't swinging at officers or fighting them, or he was unarmed. He didn't have a violent history. That wasn't his background. And to see him say that he couldn't breathe, and then most of us only saw the clips, but if you watch the entire video, I've spoken to family members of his and representatives and attorneys that work with him. If you watch the entire video, they believe, and it appears, that Eric Garner was actually dead on the sidewalk right there. That they didn't take him to the ER and he died minutes later or whatever. They believe, and if you look at it from all indications, he was dead there on the sidewalk, and no one was rendering any medical aid. They even kind of just poked at him, and later one of them said they thought he was faking, which if you watch the video, there's no way anybody thought that was fake. But I thought, and this was in July of last year, I thought that if I helped make that video famous, I thought that it would produce a certain level of justice. My assumption was that what I saw in the video was so disturbing and so obvious and so unjust that if more people saw it, certainly someone would be held accountable for it. But Officer Daniel Pantaleo, who was the one who choked Eric Garner, chokes had actually been banned in New York for almost 13 years. They then started this rhetorical discourse of saying that actually technically it wasn't a choke, but it's something else. And not only was he not charged or arrested, he wasn't fired, he's still employed, and he has 24-hour security, and actually is kind of on paid leave, has gained almost 100 pounds since he killed Eric Garner. And so I was wrong. I was deeply wrong, like frustratingly wrong, because so many of us, grossly so even, made that video widely seen, and it did nothing for the type of justice that we wanted. Now, in the NYPD recently, the city of New York actually recently paid the family an enormous settlement, multi-millions of dollars, and New York City has actually paid in the past 10 years almost $1.3 billion to police brutality victims, and not one officer is incarcerated for any of those $1.3 billion of settlements. I mean, to do the math on it, his family, Eric Garner's family, received around $5 million, and they've settled $1.3 billion of police brutality claims. So if all of them, which they aren't, just cost $5 million, some of them are 100,000, 200,000, some of them are even more, you see that hundreds and thousands of people just in New York City are deeply affected by it. Then I really made the same assumption with Mike Brown. There was a young man who was shot and killed by police in Cleveland named Tamir Rice. He was actually a boy. He's not a young man. He was in 6th grade, a middle school student. The sweetest boy. I've seen photos and videos, and I've worked with his family. Sweetest boy ever. Never in trouble. Never a problem child. He liked to sing and play sports, and was killed at a park by police in what really, for all intents and purposes, was a drive-by. Police never even stopped the car when they shot him. They said they believed he had a real gun. It was a toy gun that he had only had literally for 45 minutes. It wasn't even his. He had made a little trade with another boy in the neighborhood, and police literally did not stop the car. Within about 1.6 seconds of seeing him, they shot him in his stomach. And if you read any of the news stories, they don't tell you at all how horrific it was. But for 8 minutes, he was there. He lived for 12 hours, but for 8 minutes, he was there on the snow, and the police completely ignored him. Like, it's on video, you can see it. And 2 minutes after they shoot him, his older sister, who's 15, hears her brother and is told that he's been shot, and she comes and she's screaming. It's a terrible thing to see. And they literally tackle her like a linebacker and put her in the back of the police car. And she is about 1.5 feet away, locked in the back of the police car from where her brother is bleeding to death. And quite literally, his guts are coming out. And one of the police officers sits on the hood of the car. And they're just chilling right there. Then an FBI agent who happened to be close by hears the call on the radio, shows up, and literally is like, what in the hell are you doing? This is clearly a boy. And not that if it was a man you wouldn't render first aid, but why aren't you rendering aid? The paramedics come, take him. He fights to live, lives through the night, and dies early the next morning. It was 11 months ago, and it's on film, and they still say that they're investigating. Nobody has been charged, nobody has been fired. The officer who shot him was actually fired from his previous job for gross incompetence, including extreme crying, bouts of crying at the gun range because of emotional and mental instability. And his supervising officer said in his closing statement that I do not believe Officer Timothy Lohman should ever work in law enforcement. And he was hired by the Cleveland police, and then less than a year later killed Tamir Rice. And I knew in my mind, he was the youngest person shot and killed by police for several years before that, and any time since that, 12 years old. I knew that someone was going to be held responsible for that. That he wasn't a big, strong man the way they claimed Mike Brown or Eric Garner were. He was a boy, didn't matter. That over the past year, so far in this year, 905 people up till last night have been killed by police in the United States. We're on pace to have over 1,200 people killed by police this year. No developed nation in the world has 100 people killed by police in a year. Most have in the single digits, including the United Kingdom and even countries of comparable size or even larger than us, be it China or Japan, even Russia, Canada, Germany. You combine all of those countries together, and some of them, you combine them all together and they may have 3 or 4 or 5 times our population, but significantly fewer still people killed by police. And a movement has started of people who have crossed over and gotten to a point, and I'm a part of that movement, of people who are so incredibly frustrated that we've decided to make it a huge part of our life's mission to tell these stories, because it does not have to be this way. And contrary to popular belief or just common assumption, it has not always been this way. And that's where I want to introduce this concept from Leopold von Ranke, and I'd like for you to wrap your mind around it with me. So the traditional, and this was in the mid-1800s, the traditional study of history suggested that, and it's still very much the assumption today, that humanity was getting better. And if I had a graph, it would be, in essence, that there would be an upward curve, that people and the things people do, that they are growing and improving. And von Ranke said, I think that's very, very wrong. Now, this is in the mid-1800s. This is still during American slavery. This is before the Holocaust. This is before Rwandan genocide, before American Jim Crow, before Officer Timothy Lohman killed Tamir Rice and let him be there all by him. He could have at least held his hand. Before he refused to hold his hand, von Ranke said, actually, I've laid out all of human history that I know up till the mid-1800s, and it is not this steady climb of improvement. He did not compare, as far as I know, there weren't roller coasters the way we know them in the mid-1800s, but he basically said, no, it is not this steady incline of the 1850s are better than the 1840s, which were better than the 1830s, that it is a roller coaster of peaks and valleys, of destruction and civilization, of improvement and failure. And he said, instead, there is not this steady improvement. And he said, there's something inside of people that wants to believe that. He even said, we want to believe it about ourselves. That in 2015, I'm a better person than I was in 2014, and I'm better than I was in 2013. He even challenged that notion. That wasn't his core thought. His core thought was about humanity altogether, but he said he believes that idea comes from this notion that you and I want to believe that we are constantly getting better. And he said, no. And I'm not even going to get into that because that offends people. He said, no, I don't even believe that's true. He said, but instead, humanity operates from a set of principles. And each culture, each country, each generation may have slightly different principles, but you could judge it more based on how did this generation do with the technology and changes that it had based on the principles that governed it. And I believe him. That is to say that if humanity was steadily getting better, how do we explain the Holocaust? How do we explain Rwandan genocide? How do we explain lynching in the American South, in Atlanta? How do we explain periods of extreme behaviors? How do we explain, if we are getting better, the 22 people who were just killed in the Doctors Without Borders hospital? If things are getting better, how do we explain that this year we're on pace to have the most people ever killed by American police? If things are getting better, how is it that 200,000 people were incarcerated in 1960, but 2.2 million people or more are incarcerated today if things are so much better? And that was Von Ranke's point. He wasn't even critiquing it. He wasn't an ethicist. He wasn't even saying it was right or wrong. He just said, listen, for all of you who come after me, who study history, please don't operate under the assumption that your generation is so much better than the previous generations. And I'll say to you, and we can talk about it, I have operated under that assumption, that particularly as it pertains to matters of race and violence and poverty, I think the common American assumption, and there are at least two people who are often used as a reason for this assumption, the common assumption is that America today, at the intersection of all issues of race in particular, is just exponentially better than it was in previous generations. I want to challenge that. But when you challenge it, people said it must be better because Barack Obama is a black president and because Oprah Winfrey exists. I'm simplifying it. Well, yeah, I mean, we are better in a lot of ways. It was a breakthrough for our nation to elect an African American president. But mind you, 100% of the nation did not vote for him. As a matter of fact, a huge portion of the nation vigorously opposed him. And had the candidates against him not been so bad, we could have potentially had a different outcome. But Barack Obama was not elected president because racists grew to love him. All studies show that hate groups have grown. Some studies show exponentially during his administration. Some studies show that they have grown 300 to 400%, the number of extreme groups and hate groups who have him at the center of why they are so angry, some variation of him and his personality of why they're so angry. But it's hard for people to understand the time that they're in. And I was just speaking a few minutes ago about Ambassador Andrew Young with some of you that are here. And I've talked with him and others who will tell you that during the early days of what we know of the civil rights as the civil rights movement, they did not call it the civil rights movement. Like, that's retrospective. When they were in Montgomery and boycotting buses, they weren't doing so as a part of what they knew to be a moment in history called the civil rights movement. They were doing it because there was extreme discrimination and mistreatment, and it was on public transportation in Montgomery, and they were tired of it, and they acted based on that. And so here we are, 2015, we're in this time, and just like all previous generations, I want to suggest to you that we are not that self-aware of how good or bad things truly are. Because when you wake up, like me, you wake up and you are thinking about your routine. You're thinking about brushing your teeth, you're thinking about breakfast, you're thinking about how you wish you had more time in the morning to prep for the day. You are thinking about the stress of the day. You're thinking about, I'm definitely thinking, for me, I'm thinking about bills, how I every month have more month than I have money. And that's just a consistent theme in my mind. And I'm not thinking about where we are in the context of history. But the thesis of my book and of this conversation is that I truly don't believe that 2015 is markedly better than 1955 or 1925. I just don't believe it. I don't believe it at all. Let me say it more clearly. I don't believe evidence bears that out. Certain feelings feel differently, and different people could take very ugly takes on it. Like I heard Donald Trump speak recently, and I spoke at Yale Law School yesterday, and Donald Trump a week ago was in Connecticut, and he said something very ugly. He was speaking to a rally in Connecticut, and he was speaking about immigration policies in the 1950s. And he then made this phrase. He said that, he's talking about the 1950s, he says, that was when America was great. And he did this thing, and the crowd just went crazy. And my hunch is that they were excited about 1950s America for all of the wrong reasons. And when I saw that crowd cheer about how great he said 1950s America was, I cringed. But I think there's going to be a generation who looks back on 2015 with very equal confusion about what 2015 is really all about. I don't know if you got a chance to see the documentary on HBO from Vice about the criminal justice system, but it was, I'm not a spokesperson for Vice or HBO, but it would be worth the price of getting it. It was a 2-hour documentary. President Obama visited a federal penitentiary, and they showed that interview. But what was particularly powerful were the human stories they told on the toll that the current justice system is taking on good people. They told one story of a man who had been in prison for 20 years, and for his first offense of selling drugs. He wasn't even a kingpin. He was like a regular, broke, struggling guy. And he had been there for over 2 decades. And under drug sentencing laws, judges have the prerogative to actually give you life for what he was convicted for. And he has virtually been in prison his entire adult life for this drug offense. And millions of people are there. But for most of us in the room, the homeless, prisoners, and I would probably say 4 or 5 other groups of people, undocumented workers, for a lot of Americans are throwaway people. and they truly, really don't give a shit about what happens to them. And so that's how you can go from 200,000 people in jail to 2.2 million, because a lot of America really doesn't care. Or I'll even push that assumption, a lot of Americans like it and prefer it that way. And that's based on evidence. Most Americans are fine with some of the laws and are not really protesting how many people are in prison. I think the only thing that's different about 2015, the only thing that's extremely different, really, it's not income equality, because that's not better. And it's certainly not racism. And I could tell you horrific stories. Let me interject this. I have a story that I wrote about 29 different police departments last year whose officers were caught in audits of their text messages on their government phones calling black folk niggers. In those 29 departments, it included hundreds of officers. In 2014, they did this. They weren't like going back. There were no text messages in the 60s. We're talking about last year and this is what blew my mind. We're talking about in San Francisco, America's liberal bastion, in Miami, in Dayton, Ohio, in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. They did audits where they were able to access the text messages of their officers because someone had reported different officers in different departments, and those departments did audits and often found, including in Ferguson, the DOJ requisitioned the text messages of all the officers in Ferguson and found that the captain of the Ferguson Police Department, Richard Hinkey, who had been there for over 20 years, was sending pictures of Barack Obama as a chimpanzee, that the lieutenant, William Mudd of the Ferguson Police Department, sent a text message stating that black women who get abortions should get $5,000 rewards from Crime Stoppers. He'd been there for almost 30 years. And text messages like that and a whole lot worse. That I have almost no filter, things that I can't hardly repeat myself, in police departments all across America last year. We're not talking about they audited the text messages of the Klan. We're talking about of officers who primarily spend their time policing communities of color, particularly arresting, sometimes at a 10-to-1 ratio, African Americans to whites. Even though every study, Google it, see it for yourself, shows that whites and blacks use drugs at the same rate, and some studies show that out of the 10 most used drugs in America, whites use 9 of those drugs more than blacks. But African Americans are arrested and incarcerated at a rate exponentially higher for those things. To the point that President Obama kind of skirted around the Vice documentary that our past 3 American presidents have admitted purchasing marijuana and cocaine, purchasing and using it. Like, we kind of step back from it a little bit, and say that they used it, but they participated in that system, our American presidents. Yet millions of people are incarcerated, and I have an annotated bibliography, if you will, of all of these departments. And so we assume that 2015 is markedly better. And there are things that have changed. And some of it is that we no longer have blacks only and whites only signs. And I'm glad those signs don't exist. And I'm glad some of the policies that fueled those things have changed. But if you read Michelle Alexander's book, Jim Crow, and if you read any book, that would be the book I would want you to read, would be her book, The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander, and she's a law professor at Ohio State University. She tells you that all of those policies were just replaced with new policies, and some of them have been far worse than the ones that we fought so hard to remove. I think the big difference that exists in this moment is social media. As simple as it is, the advent of Twitter and Facebook and Instagram and other emerging platforms, be it Snapchat or others, and YouTube, the emergence of free technology and the proliferation of access to those technologies, be it the access to the internet, which is growing every year, not just in the United States, but all over the world, the lowering cost of cell phones and computers and the access of those in schools and libraries and elsewhere, is the primary difference between this generation and previous generations, because it allows people to tell the stories of injustice and spread the stories of injustice in ways that they couldn't in previous generations. I'll push it a little bit and give you an illustration. I had never heard of Ferguson, Missouri. Like, raise your hand if you had heard of Ferguson, Missouri. No, nobody in the room. And I didn't know anything about it. And it would be like McDonough, Georgia. You know, it was in that you kind of have to live here. And you could even live in Atlanta and not know, depending on where you live, and not know where McDonough is, not know how to pronounce it like McDonough, because it's not really the way it looks in the spelling. You would not know how to get there, not know, like, do any of you know the mayor of McDonough? Do you know the mayor's name? Is it a woman? You don't know. I mean, who knows? And we live here. That was Ferguson. To most of us, it was a very, very local place with a really peculiar history. And the DOJ's deep dive of an investigation into Ferguson, there's a whole book out basically that they did, was so revealing. The only reason we know about Ferguson is not because what they did was so egregious, because it was really because of social media. And connected to that is the protesters and the people who were frustrated and angry who showed up, but who learned about it from social media themselves, even locally. That is, on the day Mike Brown was killed, I was very tragically writing an article about Eric Garner when someone sent me a text message from St. Louis and said, hey, and they told me Ferguson was a neighborhood. At that time, that's how I was thinking of it on that day. Hey, there's this neighborhood in St. Louis called Ferguson, and there's this kid that's been killed, and he's laying in the middle of the street, and folk are losing it. And I literally went to Twitter and searched Ferguson, and it had only happened maybe 90 minutes before I went on Twitter, and I could see hundreds of people talking about it. I could see videos, and what I know now is Mike Brown was not the first person killed by police in or around Ferguson, but he was the first person with that story killed in the age of social media. To the point that growing up, I'm 36, growing up, I thought that police brutality was a New York and Los Angeles thing, because the stories that I heard were of Rodney King in Los Angeles, men like Amadou Diallo. Maybe you've heard of Sean Bell. He was a man, he was shot over 50 times by police, unarmed, on his wedding day, literally leaving his bachelor party with his best men, who were also shot but did not die. And those stories made national news. And it gave me and it gave the country the impression, wrongly, that the centers of police brutality were in New York and LA. Well, why was it told that way? Because those were the old media capitals of America. The two largest cities in the United States also had the largest media footprint, the largest number, quite literally, of cameramen, of journalists, of writers, of stations, the largest reach. So when something happened in those cities, it gave all of us the impression that that's where police brutality went down. Now with social media, we realize that no, it goes down in Charleston, which is where Officer Michael Slager shot and killed Walter Scott, who was unarmed and fleeing, was far away, and shot him. We saw the video released on social media, and he had told his supervisors something completely different. And then they saw the video and arrested him immediately. 10 officers have been arrested for murder this year, which is twice as much as any previous year in the past 10 years. Even though 905 people have been killed, 10 officers have been arrested, but 0 have been convicted. 0 convictions. But we are grasping for straws, so much so that charges feel like a victory, but they're not a victory. They are the clue that victory is possible, but no officers, even in the most egregious cases, have actually been convicted for any of these crimes. Social media, all of a sudden, connects people together who otherwise would not know each other. It connects people in cities and states together who have real affinities that otherwise would be completely anonymous to one another. And it connects families to news outlets so that even as soon as 2010, or as recently as 2010 or 2011 or 2012, if you suffered a very real case of police brutality, there was almost a guaranteed certainty that your story was going to remain a highly local story. But because of the way social media works, stories that would be extremely local, like the story of Ahmed Muhammad, who brought a homemade gadget to school. Whatever you think about Ahmed Muhammad, he was interrogated for for several hours in school. He denied it over and over and over and over again that it was a bomb or meant to look like a bomb. And anybody who understands that technology would understand that it wasn't. But he was humiliated, arrested, actually taken to the jail. They have not released his mugshot because it would be too embarrassing. But his fingerprints were taken, mugshot was taken. 2 or 3 years ago, that would have remained a Dallas story. But social media caused it to really cross over. And before you knew it, he was offered an internship by Facebook and Twitter, that people from NASA reached out to him and explained to him that they liked his inquisitive nature and willingness to tinker. Social media made that happen. Or even just a few days ago, this swings both ways. When the shooting in Oregon took place, you could see students who were tweeting that they heard the gunshots, and for 90 minutes, all we really knew was what those students were tweeting. And then later that evening, or maybe the next day, I think, Jeb Bush, and if you hear what he said, it actually sounded way better than the soundbite in context. But in speaking about Oregon, he talked about how stuff happens. And so then the hashtag stuff happens took off, and people were critiquing him for being insensitive. But while people were critiquing Jeb Bush for being insensitive about saying stuff happens, a hospital was, Doctors Without Border hospital was bombed, and at least 9 of their workers, 22 people in all, were killed, and we knew about it because they were tweeting about it. And before it broke mainstream media, people who were there were sharing photos of the hospital on fire. And because the White House briefing room was closed, people from Doctors Without Borders were saying, we called for 90 minutes, and 60 minutes after we called, they kept bombing. And so before the United States could get out and release their very clean story, the ugly truth was already out. And so the United States, it's actually extremely ugly. That morning, I think it was Saturday morning, the United States came out and basically said what Jeb Bush said about Oregon. The United States sent an admiral out and he said this was collateral damage, which is in a lot of ways a more nuanced way to say stuff happens. Now they're saying it was a mistake, and journalists are on it because it doesn't appear that it was a mistake. It appears that they did bomb it on purpose, and there appears to be a ton of evidence that even people in Afghanistan, Afghanistani military officials are saying that no, there were targets there that were meant to be shot. Now the United States came out today and are suggesting it was bad coordinates. But social media is the equalizer there, because people who experienced it can now share what they experienced, and thousands or millions of people, tens of millions of people can see it and share it and retweet it. Or if you're on Facebook, share it with your network and share it again and again and again. I shared something on Facebook this morning, and right before I got in, I checked it, and over 700,000 people had looked at it. And it was, someone wrote a ridiculous thing about Michelle Obama, and I wrote just a critique of it, and it just took off. And social media is the equalizer. But the thing is, a lot of people are saying that it also, and I've heard good people say this, that injustice is not growing, but social media is just causing the stories to be told more often. And I think both of those are only partly true. I think injustice is growing, and the incidents of injustice are growing. And I think facts bear that out and studies bear that out. And social media is giving more people a platform and an opportunity to share those stories. But I believe, I'll transition with this and then take some questions. I see the time. I believe that if we looked even at the worst periods of lynching in America, this year so far, up until yesterday, 905 people have been killed by police. Some of those, and my intention is to always be honest about those. Half of those were close to being unavoidable with the conditions that exist. Since you have armed police and you have armed people who are in very rough situations, and police are trained the way they are trained, with the reality that exists, half of those, I think, were going to happen. I'll stop short of saying should have happened. The other half I have real questions about. But then I'll boil even that half down. 33 unarmed, nonviolent African Americans have been killed by police this year. 33, boiling that all the way down from 905 to those 33 cases. The last year in American history that 33 people were lynched was 1922. I sincerely and earnestly compare, and I think they are the moral equivalents. In fact, taking a deeper dive that we don't have time for today, most of those cases in the 20s were, by most I mean as many as 3/4 of the lynchings in the 1920s were assisted by local law enforcement. like local law enforcement were a part. They participated in them, and that's documented. In essence, it is communities were frustrated, claimed to be frustrated at what something they believe someone did, and they served as judge, jury, and executioner. Well, in 33 cases so far this year, we've seen that happen with completely unarmed, nonviolent African-American men and women. But when we tend to think about racial violence in the United States, we think about it as a bygone era, as something that predates this generation, of something that we have overcome, and I just don't think that we have. And I think it's shape-shifted and changed and been given new names. But I think if you take a step back and look at the facts, from incarceration to police brutality to poverty, access to quality education and capital, that a lot of things about this era are disturbing and worse than other eras. So with that, it's a very serious, heavy talk. I think that because of social media, we have an enormous opportunity. Like, I tweeted something about Bernie Sanders yesterday, and then he or someone who managed his campaign followed me back, and then we engaged. Well, that's wild, that a candidate for president is that accessible. I had a friend who tweeted Hillary Clinton, and she or someone who managed the campaign replied, and he now has a meeting scheduled with her. And like not with fake Hillary Clinton or a campaign manager but with the real person. It's a real opportunity. It's a real opportunity to access people, ideas. It goes both ways because it can also be very ugly, but it's an opportunity for us to spread stories and news and thoughts. We do have a black president. We do have Oprah Winfrey. But what does that mean for the people who are suffering these issues? And how are we going to use the influence? How are you, I see it like this. You aren't responsible for what I do with my influence. That's my burden to carry. And likewise, I'm not responsible for what you do with your influence, but you are very responsible. I'm a religious person, and I'm not going to pivot into to an altar call or take an offering, but I really feel, and I've always felt, that God holds us responsible for what we do with our time and our energy and our influence. And I feel like there's an opportunity here for us to do some special stuff, but I feel like we may be on the verge of squandering some of our opportunities. And so if you have any questions, I'd love to take them. And I think we have 10 or 15 minutes, and then I'll give you my information, and you can always ask me later. Yes, sir, and then we'll work our way around. What's your name? Tom. Hey, Tom.
All right. Thank you for your talk. First of all, you mentioned Rodney King. I lived in Los Angeles at that time. And what strikes me today in looking at social media and the effect it has, for example, some of those small town cases where someone was killed, police brutality, the fact that the policeman was arrested and is going to stand trial, and maybe he's found guilty, maybe he isn't, in a lot of cases he's not. But I guess my question is, in the Rodney King's era, they took the video and it had wide distribution on the media at that time. But Daryl Gates, so it took them years to get rid of the police chief, even after they proved that it was a very racist police department in LA.
Sure.
And the four policemen who stood trial in Simi Valley, which is in northern area.
I live close out there.
They were they were exonerated.
Yeah, they were acquitted,
not guilty.
yeah.
And I guess my question is, if social media was there, would the pressure generated by social media, do you feel that may have changed the outcome of the Daryl Gates and maybe the trial and maybe the riots and that?
Maybe. I think it's a great question. Like, I was thinking about writing this fictional book about a science fiction book about what would happen in different eras if they had cell phones. Okay, and the concept for the book is a bit Back to the Future-esque, okay? But these scientists determine what time travel is, and in all time travel they always tell you, like, you can't, I don't know why, but you can't take anything with you. Well, anyway, this guy accidentally takes his cell phone, okay, but he gets stuck, and it's in like 1920s Harvard, and he goes to Harvard, and he has his iPhone, and from his iPhone, they study it, and it basically brings the advent of cell phone technology forward all the way to like the 1930s. So what was supposed to not happen until the 1990s happened 60 years earlier, and then the science fiction series. Now, if any of you steal this idea, I will know it's you, okay? It then plays out, well, how would that change different eras and generations? And, I think it would change a lot. My hunch is that in LA, that it would not have changed the verdict, because the pressure was huge already. Like, most of America thought the officers were going to be found guilty. That was the common assumption. We all saw it, and so America was saturated with that video, even without social media, without Facebook. It was a well-saturated country and nothing happened. I think what would have happened is that really severe riots, uprisings probably would have happened in other cities just as bad. And I think the one that was in LA, which was actually really bad, people historically don't realize that 100 people died, and that it wasn't just in a neighborhood, it took over all of LA County and spread from the edge of Orange County all the way up to Ventura, and it was huge. That had there been social media and people could have coordinated, I think people probably would have taken over government buildings, but back then people didn't have any way to communicate with each other. So I don't think it would have affected the verdict, but I think it would have affected the riots and the uprising in ways that would have been severe. Just thinking out loud. 1 second. Yes, ma'am, in the back, in the middle, yes.
I just want to know, what do you say to people when they talk about how Twitter and Facebook are not effective platforms for dialogue because of mob rule or echo chambers and stuff like that?
There is some truth to that thought. All of us, I'll start with my critique of it, and then I'll disagree with myself. All of our social networks tend to be of people that like us, know us, and often have very similar views. And there are variations of that, of course. Of course, you have friends who think differently than you do, but if you are an ultra-conservative American, it is highly likely, and there's studies on this that I've seen, highly likely that the overwhelming majority of your audience is also ultra-conservative. And the flip is true. So many variables there: race, ethnicity, region, age, gender, a lot of college, a lot of issues there. So you do, on social media, you do often end up preaching to the choir in a lot of ways. And dialogues can get out of hand and ugly very quickly. So that does happen, and I do see that. And the flip of it is that it's your responsibility and my responsibility to make sure that we have people in our audience that don't always agree with us, that you follow people. I don't encourage you necessarily to follow people who make your blood boil. Like, that's not good for you or anybody else. But follow people that you think are thoughtful but disagree with you and see the world differently, and then engage them with love and kindness as you get a chance. But I wrestle with it because I experience a lot of really ugly stuff in social media myself, and there are times where I don't even want to open up my social media accounts because they're so ugly. And then there are other days where I see it as a beautiful platform. That there are some days where the stuff that I write on Twitter is shared more than mainstream news, and I don't have a budget for that at all, and so it's interesting for sure.
Yes.
Just to pick your thoughts on suggestions, as far as the police brutality, I have a lot of friends who care really deeply about that issue, and I come from a community where it affects us directly. We're all raised Black men, Black sons, and so for someone who's one person, instead of thinking, because I don't like to think about it a lot. I mean, every time we hear these stories, we just, it scares us. So I don't like to think about it because I feel like that's just the way it is. There's nothing we can do.
Right.
So for someone like you who's so knowledgeable on all sides of this, what do you suggest that I can do as a person, or my friends can do as a few people about this?
Well, you're the average person in that regard. Like, it's what I do for a living, and it's extremely difficult to wade through all of that information because those are real people, and it is frightening. But the average person that I meet, the average man and woman that I meet, sees it like you and just wonders, hey, I don't want to become a specialist in this, but I would like to make a difference. There are two projects that I like a lot. One is called Campaign Zero, and it's by 5 men and women that I really admire. And if you Google Campaign Zero, they have some policy suggestions, and I helped write a few of those. And then I've started something called Justice Together. Campaign Zero has a real national arc, and Justice Together is helping people connect with other local people who think like you think but don't know where to start. And if you go to justicetogether.org, you can see some of what we're trying to do. And we're actually just spending the next few months getting to know each other. And then in 2016, we'll really launch into some local actions that regular people can take. And that's what I hear a lot is, Shaun, I am bothered by police brutality, but I have no idea what to do about being bothered by it. So Campaign Zero and Justice Together, and the two organizations are very connected. We're trying to answer those questions in a lot of ways. What's your name again, man? Jay.
Question for you is like a question and a comment. You mentioned earlier that coordinating via social media, right? And I've had a lot of college professors talk about this type of subject, and one of the things they've mentioned in the past, like when Martin Luther King had the march, the Million Man March, there was no social media. All these people who knew to show up at the Capitol or whatever on that day without newspapers or whatever the case, like they just knew. And these people were from different states all over the place because of the networks. But so with that being said, is coordinating, and it's part of that. The next end of my question is actually doing something about it, which is kind of what she was talking about.
Yeah.
So I feel like with my generation, I don't watch the news a lot. I know what's going on, like major things because of social media or whatever, but it almost seems like we're too tied to our jobs, our daily duties, for something that happens far away to even relate. Especially when you have, in general, Black people are kind of doing better. You got a lot of people living in suburbs, going to nice public schools, going to college. So taking your time, and you're already doing well, and investing yourself in something that you can't really relate to. It's almost like, sometimes I feel like racism doesn't really exist. It's more about like what your experiences are. So like racism exists, but you can't really relate to it because
in your bubble, you may not experience it like someone else does. And so, well, I think you summarized one of the things. Thank you for being honest. And I think a lot of people would, I think that's how a lot of people see the world, okay? And I think that's a lot of the reasons why I'm troubled about where we are right now. And it's a lot of the reasons why some of the problems that are actually really, really bad have grown exponentially on your watch, my watch. Some of the things that are really horrible about this country got worse and worse and worse because we have, most of us in this room, cars and homes and relative safety. And because of that, we unplug from the worst problems of the world, certainly of the world and even of the United States. We are increasingly disconnected from the ugliness of the world, even though we have more access to that information than ever before. So I'm troubled by it. I think you're accurate in your assumption for a lot of people. It does get to, what are you responsible for? What does it mean to be an American? What does it mean to be, like, are you responsible for fighting these issues? And in previous generations, people felt more responsible. And I think it gets to the decline of, and there are books on this, the decline of the American community, in that most Americans now confess that they don't even know the names of their neighbors. And an increasingly high number of Americans are not religious, are not a part of churches or community organizations. So we're becoming, although we have this feeling of connectedness on social media, we're becoming increasingly isolated individuals who don't feel the burden to act the way previous generations did. And I think it's costing real people in some frightening ways. And so you have to push through that. And even if it's, Dr. King, as far as I know, did not ride the buses in Montgomery. That's my understanding. He drove. The buses were not specifically his problem. But he chose to get outside of his comfort zone and act in that Montgomery bus boycott as if it really mattered to him personally, even though it mattered more to people that he served as a pastor there. And that's what we have to do. You have to get outside of what affects you and think more on what affects others. I'll take 2 quick questions. I have to go as well. Yes, ma'am, in the back. And my email address is my name, Shaun, S-H-A-U-N, King, K-I-N-G, @gmail.com, and you can email me. Now, I respond to about 15% of emails. So you may have to write it several times, but if you ever have a question, I'll do my best. Yes?
Shaun, great talk. And you just set me up. I would dive after this question, and everything you just said almost answered it. But what is your ultimate dream for changing hearts? We can march and we can do all these things, but how do we change hearts with all these isolated people and all these pockets? And this grows like a virus. And do you have an idea about that?
I have some thoughts.
Specifically to social media, how can we use this powerful thing?
I have a quick anecdote with that. How many of you are familiar with the story of the young man in Baltimore who was killed, Freddie Gray? You've heard that name, right? I ask people this question all the time, and the answer is my answer in a lot of ways. I ask people, tell me what you know about Freddie Gray. People's face just goes blank. I said, I don't want you to tell me what happened to him. What do you know about the man named Freddie Gray? Most people, including highly informed people who care, have no answer for me whatsoever. They don't know him. And that is in spite of the fact that his name and his story, for a period of about 72 hours, was the top news story in the world a few months ago. You remember those few months in Baltimore. But our stories are not humane, and stories of victims of injustice in America are very poorly told. And one of the reasons that I feel that I care so much is I live in those details. I do know who he was, what his dreams were, some of the struggles that he had, what life was like for him. I understand what happened to him that day and how unjust it was. But for most of America who will say, you know, to be honest with you, Shaun, I don't know a damn thing about him. It's a problem, and it allows you to not care. It gives you full permission. That's why I want you to see that documentary that Vice did, and you then see like, oh my God, that man has been in there for 22 years? For that? For $200 of drugs? Like, mind blown. You see him and see how desperate he is, how they showed his family crying every birthday, every Christmas, like heartbroken. And it humanized, because you say 2.2 million people, that means nothing. Then all of a sudden you see the name and the face and the story, and it does change your heart. So I think that's one anecdote to say, we have to start having storytelling in a way that is more three-dimensional, more colorful, more nuanced than how was a person victimized. It has to be better and deeper than that. Last question, yes.
Asha,
Hi, Asha.
really glad to hear your remarks today.
Thank you.
Being a leader and being in social media and in social justice the way you are, you're very personally and publicly attacked. How do you keep your heart strong and keep the work forward when both your words are changing minds of friends around the world and people are nothing for?
Yeah. Well, thanks for that. And it is extremely difficult. Like I do what I do because I love it. And you know, I'm one of those guys that would say I would do it for free, and I really would. And so a lot of the ugly stuff that's happened to me has really taken me by surprise. And that comes from a guy who, I see the ugly stuff that people said, but most of you probably were aware that even, you know, stuff about me even kind of hopped over the fence and went national. And for several days, I was on the front of almost every news website. It was on the national news. People had concocted several kind of ridiculous stories about me that then picked up and were repeated by the mainstream media, which also surprised me. And there are a couple of things that I do that everybody could do to endure hard times. You know, first, I make the most of the time of the people that I love and that love me, and when we're together, we don't talk about the crazy things that are going on, but we just enjoy each other's company. And you know, and those relationships have grown even deeper over the past few weeks and months. Then there's also a reality that I work hard now I don't mind genuine critiques. I'm open to that. But I work really hard to avoid the slander and the ugliness. If you Google my name or if you search my name on Twitter or anything, it's really horrific. So I don't do that. You know, I keep my eyes and my mind and my heart focused more on my smaller circle of people that I trust and respect. And then I have goals, as basic as that sounds, that I'm very determined to pursue. And I focus way more on the pursuit of those goals than I do the opposition to them. And it's that pursuit that keeps me encouraged, even in the face of the opposition. But you endure, and the key is, and I've had this as a life principle, in your very worst moments, just don't give up. And it will get better, as simple as that sounds. So for me, that was a month or two ago. It was really, really bad. And I just had to make up in my mind, it will get better. And it did get better, and it is getting better. And you know, does that mean that the opposition will leave? Absolutely not. But and then lastly, I've had to take a lot of steps and precautions for my safety and security. Even here, we had to take some steps, and that gives me some peace of mind as well. All right, I have to run very quickly. I have to take kids to the doctor. Take care. Bye.